The Seine River runs red with blood. Frankish knights in their finest armor lie broken and drowning in its waters. An entire army, France's military pride, flees in absolute terror from a wooden bridge. And standing on that bridge, laughing as they clean their axes, are just 40 Vikings. This isn't fantasy. This isn't an exaggeration. This is exactly what happened at Pont in 885 AD. By sunset, half of France's army would be dead or drowning in the Seine River. The survivors would flee in absolute terror, spreading tales of Viking demons who couldn't be killed. And it all happened because of 40 men defending a bridge. What you're about to hear is one of history's most impossible military victories. A battle so one-sided that medieval chroniclers thought it must have been divine intervention. But the truth is even more incredible. So if you're ready to discover how 40 warriors brought an empire to its knees, let's dive into one of the most insane battles ever fought. And before we charge into battle, if you're fascinated by these incredible moments in history where the impossible became reality, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because trust me, the battles we cover only get more unbelievable from here. In the late 9th century, the Frankish Empire was supposedly the most powerful Christian kingdom in Europe. But they had one massive problem: the Vikings. These Northmen had been raiding French territories for decades. They didn't just steal and leave anymore. They were setting up permanent bases along French rivers. The Seine River had basically become a Viking highway straight into the heart of France. By November 885, a massive Viking force of 700 ships and approximately 30,000 warriors had laid siege to Paris itself. Led by the legendary chief Rollo, yes, the same Rollo who would later become the first Duke of Normandy, these weren't just raiders anymore. This was a full invasion force. Paris was holding on by a thread. The city's defender, Count Odo, had maybe 200 men total defending the entire city. The Vikings had tried everything: assault towers, battering rams, even attempting to fill the Seine River with debris to march across. But Paris wouldn't fall. Not yet. Here's where our story gets interesting. The Vikings needed supplies. Besieging a city for months requires food, weapons, and materials. So they sent raiding parties into the countryside to gather resources and terrorize the local population into submission. One of these strategic positions was the bridge at Pont de l'Arche, about 100 kilometers northwest of Paris. This wasn't just any bridge. Pont de l'Arche controlled the crossing of the Seine River at a crucial point. Whoever controlled this bridge controlled the movement of armies and supplies throughout the region. The Vikings had taken it early in their campaign and stationed 40 of their most experienced warriors to hold it. Now you might be thinking, only 40 men? But these weren't ordinary soldiers. These were Viking berserkers and champions, men who had survived dozens of raids and battles. Warriors who knew that dying gloriously in battle meant dining in Valhalla with Odin himself. Each one was worth 10 ordinary soldiers in combat. Let me tell you about these specific warriors. According to Frankish chronicles, the Viking force at the bridge was led by a giant of a man named Bjorn Ironside. Not the famous son of Ragnar, but another warrior who had earned the same nickname by supposedly taking an arrow to the chest and continuing to fight. His second in command was known only as the Raven, a berserker who painted his face with ash and blood before battle, and was said to feel no pain when the battle fury took him. Now let's talk about what berserkers really were, because Hollywood gets this completely wrong. The word berserk comes from bear shirt. These warriors wore bear or wolf pelts into battle and fought in what witnesses described as an inhuman fury. They would howl like animals, bite their shields, foam at the mouth, and seemed completely immune to pain. One Arab chronicler who witnessed berserkers in action wrote, "They rushed forward without armor, were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or wild bulls. They killed people with a single blow, but neither fire nor iron told upon them." Modern historians have fascinating theories about what was actually happening. Some believe berserkers consumed psychoactive mushrooms, specifically Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that grows throughout Scandinavia. This would cause hallucinations, increased strength, reduced pain sensitivity, and the disconnection from reality that witnesses described. Others think they drank a mixture containing henbane, a plant that causes aggressive rage, delirium, and superhuman strength, but also extreme unpredictability. But here's what's really terrifying. Recent studies suggest it might have been something even more powerful, a deliberate psychological state achieved through ritual and training. These warriors would work themselves into a trance through dancing, chanting, and hyperventilation. They literally rewired their brains to shut off pain receptors and fear responses. Think of it as a controlled psychotic break that turned them into perfect killing machines. They called this state Berserker gang, the Berserker's walk, and once it began, they couldn't distinguish friend from foe, which is why other Vikings gave them wide berth in battle. The symptoms were consistent across hundreds of accounts. Their faces would change color, starting pale then turning purple with rage. Their eyes would bulge and roll back. They would shake uncontrollably before the fury hit, then explode into violence with inhuman strength. After the battle rage ended, they would collapse into a state of complete exhaustion that could last for days. Some scholars compare it to extreme PTSD episodes, except these warriors had learned to trigger and weaponize them. These 40 men were hand-picked veterans of the great heathen army that had terrorized England for years before coming to France. They had fought at York, at Reading, at Ashdown. They had stood in shield walls against Saxon kings and lived to tell about it. Many bore the scars of 20, 30, even 40 battles. In Viking culture, these scars were badges of honor, proof that the gods had tested them and found them worthy. The weapons they carried were legendary in their own right. Viking smiths had perfected pattern welding, a technique that created steel so fine that Arab chroniclers wrote poems about Viking blades. Their axes weren't the crude choppers you see in movies. They were perfectly balanced instruments of death, capable of splitting a shield and the man behind it with one swing. Some warriors carried bearded axes with extended lower blades that could hook enemy shields and pull them away, exposing the warrior behind to a killing thrust. The Frankish king, Charles the Fat, and yes, that was really his name, had finally gathered his courage and his army to respond to the Viking threat. But Charles was, let's say, not exactly a military genius. He was called the Fat for a reason. Contemporary chronicles describe him as indecisive, slow to act, and more interested in negotiations than fighting. But his generals convinced him that retaking Pont would cut off Viking supply lines and force them to abandon the siege of Paris. So Charles assembled a force of approximately 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers, heavy cavalry, infantry, local militias. This was a significant portion of the royal army. The Frankish scouts reported back, "Your Majesty, there are only 40 Vikings holding the bridge." Charles probably laughed. 40 against 4,000? This would be over before lunch. The morning of the battle, the Frankish army approached in full formation. Knights in chainmail, horses armored, banners flying. They expected the Vikings to flee at the sight of such overwhelming numbers. But the 40 Vikings did something unexpected. They formed a shield wall at the narrow entrance to the bridge and started banging their weapons against their shields, chanting war songs. They were inviting the attack. The bridge at Pont de l'Arche was maybe 4 meters wide. That's it. Wide enough for a cart to pass, but narrow enough that only a few men could fight side by side. The Franks couldn't use their numerical advantage. They couldn't flank. They couldn't surround. They had to come straight on, few at a time, into the waiting axes of the Vikings. The first Frankish charge was led by mounted knights, the elite of medieval warfare. They thundered toward the bridge, lances lowered. But horses won't charge into a wall of spears and axes. The Vikings had planted their long spears in the ground, creating a forest of points. The horses balked, reared, threw their riders. Those knights who managed to dismount and attack on foot met Viking axes head-on. Here's something people don't understand about Viking combat. These men trained from childhood. A Viking warrior could swing his battle axe for hours without tiring. They wore lighter armor than the Frankish knights, making them faster and more agile. And they fought with a psychological advantage. They wanted to die gloriously. The Franks wanted to go home to their families. The first knight to reach the Viking shield wall was Sir Guillaume of Tours, a veteran of countless battles against the Bretons. Witnesses say he lasted exactly 3 sword strokes before a Viking axe took his head clean off. His head rolled back down the bridge approach, still wearing its expensive helmet, and came to rest at the feet of the next wave of attackers. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Viking fighting technique at the bridge was a thing of brutal beauty. They fought in pairs, one man with a shield and sword, protecting a second man with a two-handed axe. The shield-bearer would block and deflect attacks, while the axeman delivered crushing blows. When one pair tired, they would step back, and another pair would seamlessly take their place. This wasn't individual combat. It was a choreographed dance of death that they had practiced for years. Then, about an hour into the battle, something happened that would haunt Frankish survivors for the rest of their lives. 3 of the Viking berserkers entered their battle fury simultaneously. Witnesses described what happened next as something out of a nightmare. These 3 warriors threw off their armor and charged forward off the bridge into the mass of Frankish soldiers. They moved so fast and struck so hard that they carved a bloody path 20 meters into the Frankish ranks before the stunned soldiers could react. One berserker, covered in so much blood he looked like he'd been painted red, was seen lifting a fully armored knight above his head and throwing him into the river. Another took 5 spear thrusts to his body and kept fighting, laughing as he pulled the spears out and used them against his attackers. The third bit through a Frankish soldier's throat like a wolf. The man's screams turned to gurgles as the berserker spit out chunks of flesh and moved to his next victim. These 3 men killed dozens before finally being brought down, and even then, the Franks had to literally hack them to pieces because they wouldn't stop fighting even with mortal wounds. The bridge became a meat grinder. As Frankish soldiers pressed forward, they had to climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The wooden planks became slick with blood. Men slipped, fell, and were cut down before they could stand. The Vikings rotated their front line, keeping fresh fighters at the shield wall while wounded warriors bound their wounds and returned to fight. After the first hour, the Frankish dead were piling up so high they formed a barrier. The Vikings would pull bodies aside just enough to create killing gaps, then slam their axes into anyone who tried to climb through. One Frankish chronicle describes a Viking warrior who killed over 20 men himself, his axe never stopping its deadly arc. The Frankish generals tried different tactics. They brought archers, but the Viking shields were thick oak, and the narrow bridge meant arrows came from predictable angles. They tried to set the bridge on fire, but the Vikings had soaked the timbers with river water in preparation. Every tactic failed against the simple reality. You could only attack a few men at a time, and those few men were the best warriors in Europe. Around midday, something extraordinary happened. The Vikings began to sing, not war chants, but actual songs, ballads about heroes crossing the Rainbow Bridge to Valhalla, about Odin's ravens feeding on the bodies of the slain, about the glory that awaited warriors who died with weapons in their hands. The singing could be heard over the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying. To the increasingly demoralized Frankish troops, it seemed like the Vikings were celebrating at their own funeral, and enjoying it. One young Frankish soldier, barely 16 years old, later told monks that he saw a Viking take 3 crossbow bolts to the chest and keep fighting. The warrior only stopped when a 4th bolt pierced his throat, and even then, he managed to kill one more Frankish soldier before collapsing. These stories spread through the Frankish ranks like wildfire. How do you fight men who don't care if they die? How do you break warriors who see death as a reward? The Frankish cavalry, the pride of medieval warfare, was completely useless. The approach to the bridge was now so clogged with dead and wounded that horses couldn't even reach the fighting. Knights who had spent fortunes on their armor and weapons were reduced to standing in line, waiting their turn to die on Viking axes. The social hierarchy of medieval warfare meant nothing on that narrow bridge. Peasant levies and noble knights died exactly the same way. There's a detail that really drives home the horror of this battle. The Vikings had a warrior whose only job was to kick bodies off the bridge into the river to keep the fighting space clear. This man, calmly and methodically, would grab Frankish corpses by their armor and heave them over the side, while his comrades continued fighting just meters away. The splash of bodies hitting the water became a rhythm. Splash, scream, axe strike, splash. Survivors said this sound haunted their dreams for years afterward. The Vikings also employed psychological warfare in ways the Franks had never encountered. They would deliberately leave wounded Franks alive but crippled, knowing their screams would demoralize their comrades. They hung captured Frankish banners upside down from the bridge, a massive insult in medieval warfare. One Viking warrior wore a necklace made from Frankish fingers, adding a new finger after each kill. These weren't just warriors. They were artists of terror. At one point, a group of Frankish priests arrived at the battlefield, carrying holy relics and chanting prayers. They believed God would protect them and inspire the troops. The Vikings let them approach unmolested until they were close enough. Then one berserker leaped from the bridge, landed among them, and slaughtered all 6 priests in less than a minute. He then calmly walked back to the bridge through hundreds of stunned Frankish soldiers who were too terrified to attack him. The message was clear. Your God has no power here. The battle had another element that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe: the smell. The combination of blood, emptied bowels, river mud, and fear sweat created a stench so overwhelming that soldiers were vomiting even before they reached the fighting. The Vikings, seemingly immune to this, would actually taunt the Franks about it, asking if they were sick from fear or just weak stomachs. This kind of psychological dominance broke men's spirits before Viking axes broke their bodies. Perhaps the most telling detail is what happened when King Charles tried to motivate his troops with a personal appearance. He rode forward in his finest armor, surrounded by his royal guard, to within sight of the bridge. The Vikings' response? They turned their backs on him and dropped their pants, showing their bare asses to the King of France. Then they went back to killing. The insult was so profound that several Frankish nobles immediately left the battlefield in shame, taking their men with them. By noon, the Frankish army was in chaos. Soldiers were refusing orders to charge. Some units were openly retreating. King Charles, watching from a nearby hill, couldn't understand how 40 men were destroying his army. Then something happened that turned defeat into complete catastrophe. A rumor spread through the Frankish ranks, probably started by fleeing soldiers trying to justify their cowardice. They said the Vikings couldn't be killed, that they were demons or trolls in human form, that their axes were cursed by pagan gods. Panic spread like wildfire. Suddenly it wasn't an orderly retreat but a complete rout. Here's where it gets really bad for the Franks. In their panic to escape, hundreds of soldiers tried to ford the Seine River rather than wait to cross at safer points. But the Seine in late 885 was cold, fast, and swollen with autumn rains. Knights in heavy chainmail sank like stones. Horses panicked and drowned with their riders. More Franks died in the river than on the bridge itself. The Vikings, seeing the rout, didn't even pursue. They stood on their bridge, covered in blood, surrounded by mountains of Frankish dead, and sang victory songs. They had won so completely that chasing the fleeing enemy would have been beneath them. But here's a detail that most histories leave out. As the Franks fled, the Vikings performed a ritual that terrified the survivors even more. They began dedicating the dead to Odin, marking bodies with runes and hanging weapons from trees as offerings to their gods. To the Christian Franks, this seemed like devil worship. Survivors would later claim they saw ravens descending from nowhere to feed on the dead. Odin's own birds come to claim the sacrifice. The Vikings also did something that demonstrated their complete confidence and contempt for their enemies. They sent one man, a single warrior, to the Frankish camp with a message. This warrior walked alone through thousands of demoralized French soldiers, delivered his message to King Charles himself, and walked back unharmed. No one dared touch him. The message was simple. The bridge remains ours. Send more men if you have them to spare. The numbers are staggering. Historical accounts vary, but most agree that between 1,500 and 2,000 Frankish soldiers died that day, either on the bridge or drowning in the Seine. That's half of the attacking army. The Vikings lost between 5 and 8 men. Let me repeat that. 40 Vikings killed or caused the deaths of up to 2,000 professional soldiers while losing maybe 8 of their own. King Charles the Fat's response to this disaster? He didn't try to retake the bridge. He didn't rally his forces for another attempt. Instead, he paid the Vikings 700 pounds of silver to leave Paris alone. That's right. After losing half his army, he paid the Vikings to go away. They took the silver and raided other parts of France instead. The political consequences were devastating. The Frankish nobility lost all respect for Charles the Fat. Within 2 years, he would be deposed, and the Carolingian Empire would effectively end. The Vikings, emboldened by their victory, would continue raiding France for decades. Rollo, the Viking leader, would eventually be given Normandy by the French king just to stop him from raiding. His descendant, William the Conqueror, would invade England in 1066, changing history forever. But think about what this battle really means. 40 men changed the course of European history. They proved that courage, skill, and tactical advantage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. They showed that numbers mean nothing if you can't bring them to bear, and they demonstrated the psychological power of warriors who genuinely don't fear death. The bridge at Pont de l'Arche still exists today, rebuilt many times, of course, but local legends say that on foggy mornings, you can still hear the clash of axes on shields and the death cries of Frankish knights. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain. On that day in 885 AD, 40 Vikings proved that sometimes the impossible is exactly what happens. The lesson here isn't just about military tactics or Viking ferocity. It's about how the right people in the right place with the right mindset can overcome any odds. Those 40 Vikings weren't superhuman. They were just men who understood their advantages, held their ground, and refused to break. They turned geography into strategy, psychology into a weapon, and legend into reality. And that's how 40 Vikings destroyed half of France's army and changed the course of European history. All because they held a bridge.